Good morning, everyone. Thank you all of our auditors for joining us and for all of our participants for joining us once again. This morning, we're having a session on affectivity and aesthetic experience with three faces who you have grown to know throughout our week together. We have John Henry Crosby, who is the president and founder of the Hildebrand Project, who is working on translating the aesthetics successfully, Dietrich von Hildebrand's aesthetics. We have Mark Spencer, the Hildebrand Project Fellow for Aesthetics and Metaphysics. And we have James Matthew Wilson joining us, a poet and of great renown. So I'm going to turn it over to Mark to get started, since I believe we just decided you were beginning.
All right, thanks, Catherine. Okay, so I just want to sketch a sort of rough outline of Hildebrand's thoughts about the role of feeling, the role of the heart in aesthetic experience. Before we get into that, I think a couple of definitions are in order, just so it's clear what we're talking about here. When I use this word aesthetic, this is a term that has a sort of broad range of meanings. It's got a couple of overlapping aspects. First of all, when I talk about aesthetic, this is from that Greek word aesthesis, sense perception. When we talk about what's aesthetic, we're talking about what can be perceived. And when we talk about perception, that primarily means sense perception, especially sight and hearing. But we can also think about perception more broadly. For example, we might say that we perceive the holiness of a saint. We perceive the injustice in an unjust situation. We perceive the essence, what it is to be a dog or a cat or a star, or a human being. So we have these sort of broader senses of intellectual perception. When we talk about perception, we're talking about any experience in which some content is directly presented to us. We don't know about it just by grasping some proposition. We don't know it just by reasoning, by proving something out. We don't know it just by testimony, by someone else telling us about it. No, we grasp it directly. So when we're talking about aesthetic experience, we're talking about this experience of perception, of directly grasping some content, and especially doing that through the senses. But aesthetic also has a second overlapping but slightly diverging meaning. When we talk about aesthetic experience, we're talking about the experience of values, that is, these properties that make things important in themselves. We're talking about values that we grasp them purely by perception. The most famous, the most prominent of such values is, of course, beauty, and its opposite, disvalue, ugliness. So beauty is a value. It calls to us. It presents itself as important in itself, but we grasp this value just in perceiving it. Contrast this to what we were talking about yesterday. Yesterday morning, we talked about moral values. Moral values are these kinds of importance in themselves that address our freedom, that address our responsibility. They place a claim upon us such that we would be guilty were we to violate them. We would fail as human beings were we to violate them. Aesthetic values aren't like that. They call to our perception. They do not place these claims of responsibility on us in the same way as moral values. Now I'm going to complicate that a little bit later, but that's maybe good enough to go on. Okay, so aesthetic has to do with these values like beauty and ugliness. We can think of other sorts of values, other sorts of ways that things present themselves as important that just address our perception. So think about, say, comedy or tragedy, to perceive something as worthy of laughter, as worthy of tears. Think about elegance, elegant fashion, an elegant way of presenting oneself. Think about values like the picturesque, the horrific, the terrifying. Each of these is an aesthetic value, a way that something presents itself as important insofar as it's perceived. Okay, now I want to focus in here, and Hildebrand in his aesthetics wants us to especially focus on beauty. So what is beauty? I want to just give a rough sketch of what I mean by beauty. And here I'm drawing not only on Hildebrand, but on a range of 20th century Christian philosophers and theologians. So when I think about beauty, I draw on people like the Thomists, Jacques Maritain, Etienne Gilson, the German, Swiss theologian Hans-Urs von Balthasar, and a range of other figures. So what do we mean when we say that something is beautiful? When we say that something is beautiful, we're saying a number of things. For example, the beautiful is that which pleases us just when we see or hear or know it, right? It pleases us immediately upon seeing it, immediately upon hearing it. And pleasure here does not just mean a sort of, titillation. It doesn't just mean a sort of momentary thrill. Rather, maybe we can understand the idea of pleasure with regard to beauty by invoking the idea of wonder or awe. The beautiful is that which awakens wonder in us just upon perceiving it. It awakens awe, amazement in us just upon perceiving it. Another way of thinking about the beautiful is the union of the true and the good. The true is the intelligible. Things present themselves to us as able to be understood. The good is the desirable. Things present themselves to us as able to be desired. The beautiful joins these two together. Just in understanding, just in perceiving something, we see it as desirable. We can also think about the beautiful as a complete holistic form, a complete structure that things have. Think about a beautiful painting. A beautiful painting has a holisticness to it. All the parts fit together, all the parts are in their right place, and they shine forth. They present themselves as this beautiful and rapturing whole, this beautiful form. Okay, so as I'm talking through these different notes of the beautiful, and I could go on forever probably talking about this, notice that every time I've talked about some aspect of the beautiful, I have had to invoke some emotion, wonder, awe, pleasure, and rapturing. And Hildebrand focuses in on this fact. Beauty and those other aesthetic values, the comic, the tragic, the elegant, and so forth, beauty does not just present itself to sense perception. We only fully grasp beauty because it affects us, because it moves us. That is, because it awakens that affective sphere. The beautiful is what presents itself as intelligible in a felt way. We grasp the meaningfulness of the landscape, the painting, the symphony, the person that we are seeing precisely in it. Hildebrand, like, the beautiful speaks a word to us, but it's a word that addresses our affections, and it calls for an answering word, a completing word. We need to, as it were, say something back to the beautiful. And that answering word is this responding emotion, this wonder, this awe. Now, this experience of being affected helps us see that beauty is something that's out there in the object itself. The experience of beauty is not primarily one of constructing our ideas of the beautiful. It's not one of projecting ideas out there into the world. No, the experience of the beautiful is this experience of being taken out of myself by what I perceive. This experience of being moved to delight and awe in an unexpected way. This helps us see that the beautiful is a value that's out there in the things themselves. But, and here Hildebrand makes a really crucial distinction, it's not out there in the things themselves like the way that, say, mathematical properties are out there in a sort of purely objective way. It's out there in the things themselves, but in a way that addresses human beings. Hildebrand calls this the human aspect of the world, or the human face of the world. In aesthetic experience, we see how the world is, in a sense, there for us. They're addressing us. And Hildebrand doesn't hesitate to theologize this. He says the word that we hear in beauty is a word from God. There's a sort of absoluteness to it. There's a sort of personal presence there in the beautiful. which addresses our feelings, which awakens our wonder. And Hildebrand goes even one step further. In the closest thing he gives to what I would say is a sort of strict definition of the beautiful, he says, the beautiful is that which seems to love us when we perceive it. There's a sense of beautiful, again, landscapes, artworks, physical features of people, this experience of the beautiful drawing us into union with it, and bestowing peace and wonder and awe upon us. Right? Just like a loving person would do. What does a loving person want to do? A loving person wants to draw his or her beloved into union with them in whatever way is appropriate to the love in question, and bestow blessings, bestow good things upon their beloved. Right? The experience of the beautiful is like that. It's this experience of being loved by perceivable things. So affectivity is central to the experience of the beautiful. I have a lot more I would like to say about this, but in the interest of time, let me just close with one point, and we can come back to things in the Q&A. I'm just noticing the time, and I could probably go on for 5 or 6 hours about this. The experience of our affections in the face of the beautiful and in the face of that, all those other aesthetic values, I think helps us better understand something about value that maybe was unclear from yesterday. And it's unclear if we just focus on moral values. A lot of times when we think about value and this idea that things call for a certain response, that they have this importance in themselves, we tend to think about that purely in moral terms. We tend to think about normativity, this idea that we are commanded to act in certain ways, only in moral terms. And when we think about moral terms, we think about how we're responsible to make a response, how we'd be guilty if we didn't make a response. The way that Hildebrand focuses on the way that aesthetic values call for certain feelings and awaken certain feelings helps us see that there are different kinds of normativity than moral normativity. There are different kinds of calls, different kinds of commands that are issued to us other than moral commands. The beautiful calls for a response of wonder, but it doesn't call for that response in a moral way. That is, you're not a bad person. You're not bad insofar as you're a human being if you fail to give that response. You failed in some sense. You failed to give the proper response, but it's not a moral failing. So this helps us see human life is in a sense broader than moral life. Human life includes feelings, and the world includes addresses to us that go strictly morals. It's to Hildebrand's great credit that he spends so much time mapping out that sphere, mapping out the different sorts of values and feelings that are present there. Okay, I want to give the other panelists time to talk, so I'll stop there, loath as I am to do so. So I think John Henry is next.
Okay, thank you, Mark. That was fantastic and very full of clarifying commentary, including on discussions that we've had so far. And I think that your idea, just to briefly pick this up, of the way in which we feel loved through aesthetic values, the way in which aesthetic values address us in a sometimes very personal way, perhaps can be further developed. And Van Hildebrand, again, seems to speak in this sense sometimes, which is that there can be a providential dimension in the way in which beauty reaches us. And that, of course, brings us back to the gift character of values and particularly of affective responses to values. In other words, that there are times in our lives when a particular aesthetic experience, an experience of beauty, reaches us in a way that we couldn't have, even prepared ourselves for. It catches us off guard. I find that with works of art, you have sometimes the experience that it's there for you, or you encountered at a certain time in life that is particularly, when that work can speak to you in a particularly powerful way. And then sometimes that work, so to speak, goes into your library of things that has influenced you, and then you come back to it later on and you see it in new and deeper ways, and it's as if the work has new things to say to you. And if we take that full theological sense of God addressing us through beauty, I think you have a very rich way of accounting for aspects of our experience that might in some sense go beyond sort of what's in the work per se, but which is nevertheless very much given in the experience of work and has a powerful impact on us. So I want to look, in some sense, build on what you have offered here in your comments and explore essentially two points I'd like to make, also in the interest of time. The first is to look a little bit more into the structure of aesthetic experience as Van Hildebrand sees it, and to look especially at this ecstatic dimension of it, which I think is so central in his understanding of it. Then I would want to look very briefly at some of the liabilities, so to speak, that are present in aesthetic experience and experience of beauty that Van Hildebrand analyzes. Van Hildebrand is a wonderful analyst, not just of the paradigmatic cases of value perception, say, of aesthetic experience, or of the moral life. You know, he has these analyses of moral exemplars and also of aesthetic exemplars. He's also very good at analyzing all sorts of different kinds of deformations and liabilities and weaknesses that can, if not entirely poison the aesthetic experience, it can severely undermine it. So just first to this theme of the ecstatic dimension in beauty, we've already spoken in the seminar a great deal about the gift character of the emotions. As Van Hildebrand says, in the heart, man is deeper than what is in his immediate control, particularly in the control of his will, but even in the control of his intellect. There are these dimensions of our being that are activated in a unique way by experiences of beauty. And this experience, as you've already alluded to, can surprise us and take us off guard. But in some sense, that's just a sort of foreshadowing of the power with which beauty can move us at times. Van Hildebrand speaks very beautifully in the introduction to his aesthetics. And I should say that in the aesthetics, he says, beauty clearly has a tremendous impact on the moral development of the person, on the joy in a person's life, in human life. But we're going to analyze the nature of beauty in this volume, and the nature of art in the second volume. And I just wish he had written an entire book on beauty in human life. So much of what he would say can be deduced out of his aesthetic writings. But in this foreword to the aesthetics, you have a particularly powerful expression of what he would have said. So I just want to read this very beautiful passage in the section called The Significance of Beauty for the Development of Personality. And he says here, Plato writes, at the sight of beauty, the soul grows wings. Genuine beauty liberates us in many ways from the force of gravity, drawing us out of the dull captivity of daily life. At the sight of the truly beautiful, we are freed from the tension that urges us on towards some immediate practical goal. We become contemplative and we expand, and even our soul itself becomes more beautiful when beauty comes to meet us, takes hold of us, and fires us with enthusiasm. It lifts us above all that is base and common. It opens our eyes to the baseness, impurity, and wickedness of many things. So here you have Van Hildebrand giving such a beautiful expression of the way in which beauty can enrapture us and carry us out of ourselves. And since this is a seminar about the emotions in a particular way, I want to highlight in the heart the beautiful discussion Van Hildebrand has in chapter 2 of non-spiritual and spiritual affectivity, of the two kinds of madness discussed by Plato in the Phaedrus. And I won't discuss it here at length or I certainly won't read from it because of the time again that we're time limitations that we're facing here. But he speaks about a lower way of being out of our minds and a higher way of being out of our minds. And the essential experience of the lower form is certainly one of the solid ground going out from under our feet. It can be ecstatic and exhilarating. It can be completely overpowering. But there are these telltale characteristics of that experience that for Van Hildebrand are deeply questionable because they involve a loss of the light of reason. There's a kind of darkness in that experience. We can become engulfed by our passions. There's a downward pull in this. And then he speaks about the other kind of divine, well, to use Plato's language, the divine madness, which is which is always in response to a good endowed with a high value. In other words, it doesn't just happen spontaneously or in a causal way in our psychic life. It's always in relationship to something that addresses us. So Van Hildebrand is always very clear about that. But the result is not a blurring of one's reason. I'll read here a few lines. He says, it's an extraordinary elevation by an intuitive awareness, which far from being irrational has a supra-rational and luminous character. And far from including any tendency to dethrone our free spiritual center, far from trying forcibly to overpower our reason and will, and ecstasy calls for a sanction by our free center. It makes an appeal for this sanction. So the further idea is that when we have an experience, for example, the experience of a great piece of music that strikes us and moves us profoundly, there is in a certain sense even a kind of ethical dimension. He says that Beethoven's music isn't just here for, in other words, the responses of enthusiasm and admiration are not sufficient in the case of certain great works of music and art. There's an appeal to something deeper in us. He says of Beethoven that Beethoven wants to call us to alertness, to awakenedness, and there's a kind of demand that we give ourselves to the experience of the beautiful. But despite this ecstatic and overpowering dimension, which can be so liberating and transformative in the life of a person, there is always this luminous dimension, as Van Hildebrand says, and always this appeal to our free spiritual center. So I simply want to underscore this ecstatic dimension, not because it's the paradigmatic case of all experiences of beauty, but because it's the dimension of beauty that perhaps we all most associate with transformative moments in our life. Conversion can be linked. In other words, the power of a profound experience of beauty can be so great that it can prompt a conversion. It can prompt a complete re-examination. It can even do the things for us that are outside of our control. We've spoken about how difficult it is to overcome a vicious nature. And of course, divine grace is an essential dimension in any conversion. But Van Hildebrand wants to say that the experience of the beautiful has a kind of grace-like quality in that when it reaches us in a profound way, it can have this complete reorienting effect on us. Sometimes to the extent that it takes a long time to fully realize what's happened in us. And as I think Mark pointed out the other day, of course, there can be a learning curve. Sometimes the rest of us sort of limps along as we catch up with what's happened very deep in us. Nevertheless, I want to just give special due attention to this particular powerful dimension of beauty, while fully acknowledging that there is beauty in a much more sort of widespread sort of way. I love Roger Scruton's idea of everyday beauty. This is the beauty not of exquisite works of art. This is the beauty of a well-set table, of a beautifully decorated room, even an orderly space has a kind of beauty and nobility and dignity. And to be surrounded by all of that, Van Hildebrand's we drink in, and so I don't want to in any way de-emphasize the importance of beauty in even its most modest and apparently inconspicuous aspects, but simply to emphasize also this very powerful dimension of beauty, and also to underscore that Van Hildebrand in his rehabilitation of the heart is deeply concerned not just with vindicating beauty, not just with vindicating the emotional life, but even vindicating these very intense and powerful and apparently overcoming emotional experiences. Let me see here what I've really run out of time already. I'm going to take just a couple more moments because this session was devoted to the theme of aestheticism. So Van Hildebrand is extremely keen in all of his analyses, whether of the moral life, the emotional life, of the kind of liabilities to which the different powers of the human being, if I can use that language, are vulnerable. So in the emotional sphere, as you might imagine, there are innumerable vulnerabilities to which we are subjected. They're discussed powerfully in the heart, vividly in the heart. I would say that chapters 10 and 12 of Aesthetics Volume 1 is it's sort of an extraordinary tour through all sorts of deformations in our emotional life with respect to the beautiful. So when he speaks about mediocrity, for example, and not just mediocrity in terms of sort of being below average, but mediocrity in the sense of a kind of hostile stance towards higher values, an unwillingness to be moved out of our complacency, a desire to relativize everything. Van Hildebrand is identifying a particular affective deformity, obviously with let's just say, one would have to acknowledge that there are intellectual and volitional dimensions in this deformation. This isn't just the stance of an affective response. This is a stance of the whole person. So I think that Van Hildebrand is extremely strong in the analysis of these deficiencies, and I would say that though I can't imagine that most of our viewers, many of whom are very serious about the pursuit of beauty in their lives or understand its power, would find themselves in the pages of these assessments. I mean, these are in some cases almost grotesque characters, not caricatures, but characters. But it's enormously helpful for understanding the adequate relationship of beauty, the kind of responses that Mark was speaking about before, this kind of aesthetic normativity, to see vividly sketched instances of people or personalities that lack this due relation. And mediocrity is one, triviality is another one that Van Hildebrand brilliantly analyzes. It comes very close to the idea of kitsch, which Roger Scruton, in a truly epic essay on kitsch, which I recommend to you, has analyzed much more fully. The one instance that I might highlight for you all is his discussion of sentimentality, because I think this is perhaps one which there is maybe a greater liability to, even in people who want to pursue beauty, who believe deeply that they've been touched by beauty. But this vulnerability of sentimentality that Van Hildebrand analyzes is very astute. And what he means by this is not just the word sentiment or feeling. He means a kind of self-referential structure of the emotional life, where the emotions become are experienced not in relation, not in conscious relation to objects that motivate them, but because it's pleasant to experience them. It's pleasant to feel a whole range of emotions that tend to be on the weak spectrum. So people like feeling weak in the sense that they are not robust responses to things, but they're emotions that arise. They might be sort of vaguely poetic feelings or vague feelings that are vaguely melancholy. And it's not, again, that these can't have a legitimate place in our experience, but it's when they become, in a way, the object they become their own, an end in themselves, shall we say, and they are sought for the pleasure that they can give. And I think Van Hildebrand would have said, and he says he says this is a particular American vulnerability, but there is, I think, in those of us who not only look to music, but who for nourishment, but for example, we look to sacred or religious music, there's a great vulnerability in a great deal of particularly contemporary worship music, shall we say. Not all of it, I'm not passing a blanket judgment, but there can be this tendency to sentiment. There's a lack of that object-centeredness, and the emotional life folds in upon itself. The last point I'll make very briefly is just regarding aestheticism. Aestheticism is a central category in the work of Van Hildebrand, and he says in the beginning of volume 1 of the Aesthetics that aestheticism is what many people confuse for artistic values. They think that those who have a dubious stance towards the whole realm of art, they may think it's awash in feeling, awash in sentiment, a kind of a world lacking all objectivity. They can think of it as a kind of an effeminate sphere, however one wants to characterize it. Van Hildebrand says they confuse the authentic relationship to the realm of beauty with aestheticism. And aestheticism is, you might say, the problem of sentimentality, but to be a little Hildebrandian about this, to the second or third power. Because whereas sentimentality risks a kind of lingering in one's own emotions, Van Hildebrand says that sentimentality, though, can be sometimes unconscious. There's not necessarily bad will in it. But in aestheticism, you have the complete sort of inversion of the structure of the emotion and its relationship to the object. Because in aestheticism, you have someone who might have a great deal of sort of artistic sensibility, but who looks at a great work of art not as the bearer of objective values, but as an object of refined pleasure, an object that might give them the feeling of being refined, a member of an exclusive elite, because supposedly many people don't understand what you understand. But Hildebrand says in one place that someone might have an incredibly sophisticated appreciation, for example, of the string quartets of Beethoven, and appreciate their complexity and their achievement and the emotional range that he achieves, but be completely unaware of the beauty that they offer. And this for von Hildebrand is in a way the ultimate misuse of the world of beauty, because it comes so close and yet it remains so far away from what's given to us in the experience of beauty. So he speaks about the problem, in his analysis of aestheticism, he says that the central problem is that the value response and the joy which is given as a kind of fruit is confused for the refinement, the refined pleasures that can be had from all of these different ways of appreciating the work, but never seeing it as a work of beauty. And he goes on to say that in all aestheticism there lurks this pleasure-centeredness, and I don't have time to go into it here, but I would simply direct you to the essay on aestheticism and the true disposition to art, where he analyzes the proper and the improper relationship between pleasure and certain goods, those that can be rightly consumed as objects of pleasure, and then those that, because of their values, cannot simply be pursued as objects of pleasure, but require this value responding attitude. And then he goes so far to say, in fact, in my preparation for this talk, I realized that for him, aestheticism isn't ultimately, this is my final thought, isn't ultimately a purely artistic or a problem of the aesthetic sphere. It's also a problem of the moral sphere. And here he comes very close to Kierkegaard, because he says that the aesthete doesn't just try to consume aesthetic values, beauty, as an object of pleasure. He says that the aesthete also approaches the moral sphere in that way. So for example, when the aesthete is presented with a great tragedy, a war, a burning house, when Hildebrand has all of these dramatic examples, the aesthete is not moved into action, but sees it as a kind of spectacle, and is fascinated by it, but is hesitant to involve themselves, to enter in, to respond to the moment. And then he says, interestingly enough, the aesthete, as a result of completely missing the moral demands of the moment, actually misses the deeper aesthetic dimension that might be in play there. So for example, someone who in bravery and charity intrudes into a moment, and you might say, at one level, there's a terrible aesthetic disvalue. You might have deformed bodies and woundedness and so on and so forth. But of course, you also have the beauty of great charity, the beauty of self-gift. All of this is on display. And who has authentic relationship to beauty sees even this deeper beauty, which is given in the right relation to moral values as they're presented to themselves. So in the end, for von Hildebrand, of course, beauty, as Mark said, is well, Mark hasn't used this word, but he uses the word quasi-sacramental. He thinks that beauty has this revelatory power of the world of God. And therein ultimately lies its power to move us, to address us personally, to transform us. And despite all of these vulnerabilities to which beauty is subject, von Hildebrand always held firm to the idea that we must not abandon beauty, we must not treat it as something secondary, but make central room for it in our lives. So on that note, I think I should turn it over to James, and hopefully we still have some time for questions. Forgive me, James, for running over even my own timer here.
It's fine, John Henry. I know that I elected to go last for reasons extrinsic to the content of what I wanted to say, but I'm glad I did, because what you and Mark have shared really serves as an excellent sort of primer to the aesthetics, without which I would be afraid people wouldn't understand the comments I do want to make. So I'm so glad that I get to bat clean up here. I want to actually situate Hildebrand in his historical context and situate the aesthetics in the context of the heart. That's what I'm going to do. And this little essay I've written, originally it was called More Than Just a Feeling, but just after I finished it, I was down in the basement exercising as we do in this age of quarantine, and Boston's song More Than a Feeling came on, and that was just in poor enough taste that I felt obliged to change the title of the talk. So More Than a Feeling, Affectivity and Aesthetic Experience. In the third chapter of The Heart, von Hildebrand refers to the culture of his youth as it emerged in the wake of the First World War. At that time, he writes, a strong anti-affective trend developed as a reaction against the ethos of the 19th century. It rightly opposed the ever decorous architecture of the Victorian epoch, but unfortunately believed that the true antithesis to this phony, overladen style lay in a dull, technical working out of practical necessities in architecture. Here is the cultural moment out of which von Hildebrand emerged, and consciousness of it makes his talent that much more remarkable. As he states in the pages that follow in The Heart, the era looked at the phony Victorian sentimentality of late Romanticism, which identified beauty with sincere feeling and sought a return to hardness instead. Von Hildebrand is, of course, thinking chiefly of his own continental context, where this turn originated, but those of us more familiar with the Anglophone participation in it will recognize the justness of his observation as a wider phenomenon. As a poet, I look back at the manifestos of such early modernist figures as T.E. Hume or Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot, and I just nod in agreement. Hume, for instance, whose chief interest was modern sculpture and who himself died in the war, saw that culture from the Renaissance onward had fallen prey to a naturalistic reduction of reality to the organic, to life, and to humanism in a very secular or physical sense, to a sentimental belief in progress, and to a total eclipse of religious vision. Everything from the lowest to the highest, Hume wrote, was part of a vital continuity. At the Renaissance, he tells us, there were many pictures with religious subjects, but no religious art in the proper sense of the word. All the emotions expressed are perfectly human ones. Romanticism and humanism saw only the state of, and here's one of my favorite words, the state of slush in which we have the misfortune to live, and nothing of what was hard, absolute, or enduring. What had been lost sight of were those zones of reality discontinuous with the natural, namely the inorganic world of mathematics and scientific laws, and the world of ethical and religious values, says Hume. Adapting Pascal's division of the three orders of matter, mind, and charity, Hume turned to religious art, which meant an art capable of manifesting the discontinuous, inorganic, and the absolute. He looked back to Byzantium, to Egypt, and to early classical Greece for models, all of which eschewed the smooth, rounded lines of naturalism in favor of the harsh geometries of mathematics. Such expression springs not from delight in life, but from a feeling for certain absolute values, which are entirely independent of vital things. He favored the geometrical as a critique and a chastening of the vital. When the critic Roger Fry spoke of a day when modern machinery might be made as beautiful as a rose, Hume turned on him with rage. It was not machinery, it was machinery, and not roses that were the prototypes of beauty, said Hume. From this philosophical basis follows his argument against Romanticism and in favor of Classicism. At the time Hume's writing, just to offer a good contrast, think for a moment of pretty much any passage from Tchaikovsky, but Romeo and Juliet, I think, is especially good, and just contrast that with Stravinsky's The Rite of Spring. The harshness of the geometry of sound in Stravinsky is what Hume was praising, and it was the softness, the sweet, sentimental violin of Romeo and Juliet that he held in contempt. More or less imitating Hume, Ezra Pound wrote in 1917 that 20th century poetry would move against poppycock. It will be harder. It will be saner. It will be as much like granite as it can be, and will be austere, direct, and free from emotional slither. We've got slush and now we've got slither. And Eliot, following them both, would ignite a debate between classicism and romanticism in post-war England and revive the reputation of the 17th century metaphysical poets, John Donne, George Herbert, for instance, whom he celebrated for being intellectual and difficult, that is to say, for having a hard wit. In the years before Eliot's conversion to Christianity, which came in 1927, he wrote both publicly and privately that the emotionalism of devotional writing seems unreal to him, and that he was drawn to belief rather by the hymns of Thomas Aquinas and by the intellectual rigor of scholasticism. Von Hildebrand notes how partial was this turn against affectivity. It's an anti-affective turn, but it's a partial anti-affective turn. Not emotion per se was denounced as slither, but only tender affections, while feelings such as ambition, lust for power, covetousness, or lechery remain legitimate in the art's new dispensation. And yet, von Hildebrand continues, an objective response to the world will indeed be a tender one. And tenderness is no sign of a lapse into subjectivity, that stuff of organic life Hume held in such contempt. Let me repeat and slightly elaborate this point. Von Hildebrand informs us that an objective view of reality will always include the affective. And indeed, he goes so far as to say that the kind of disengagement or neutrality in the name of objectivity made famous by Descartes is in fact the worst species of subjectivism. This makes von Hildebrand an unusual figure for his time and for two reasons. First, as we've already seen, he defends that tender affectivity his contemporaries attack. But further, he sees more clearly than they do what they are after. Their quest for objectivity, for the inorganic beauty of the machine, is no eschewing of affectivity per se. No, to the contrary, they clearly enjoyed that bracing chill of the rigid and the austere, and indeed were more concerned with the emotional effect of the geometrical than they were with geometry for its own sake. As Auden would later note, modernists simply had a taste for the acid and the austere. What I wish to consider are those ways in which von Hildebrand in his aesthetics stands within his phenomenological account of our affective value responses to beauty and art, and thereby shows himself to have consistently kept the heart at the center of his thinking, even as he returns to important premises of modernism for all its anti-affective bias and justifies them. Aesthetic writings are no apology for Victorian sentimentality, but rather are themselves a kind of modernist aesthetic manifesto. The two-volume work, first, recovers the affective as the principal feature of aesthetic experience, and second, suggests why Victorian sentimentality and subjectivism were and remain bad accounts of that experience. I just want to discuss 2 points that show this. In the opening of Aesthetics Volume 1, Hildebrand defends beauty as a real value of being and rejects the modern reduction of beauty to a feeling in the subject. Late in that same volume, and again in Volume 2, Hildebrand puts his stamp on the Kantian idea of the aesthetic experience of beauty as disinterested, a term that was retooled in the modernist period as just that chill, that hardness, that inorganic anti-affectivity he decries in the heart. We're so used to the maxims, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and that more ancient one, there's no arguing about taste, that most persons take it for granted that beauty is subjective, that beauty is simply a kind of taste, and thus that beauty is a feeling that cannot be argued over discursively. On this last point, even the late Roger Scruton held to this risible platitude in his otherwise informative book, Beauty. I apologize for having to dissent from the late Roger Scruton, but on this point, we were at loggerheads. When we consider the central role beauty as a metaphysical fact, indeed as the metaphysical fact of being par excellence, played in the classical and the medieval worlds, however, these ideas of beauty as subjective and taste will look just bizarre to us. We know how it happened well enough, as bizarre as it seems. In 1757, David Hume and Edmund Burke both published influential treatises on aesthetics. Hume noted that the beautiful remains beautiful even as our understanding of moral goodness and abstract truth changes. Beauty must therefore be a universal standard of taste, independent of either knowledge or morality. Burke's long essay on the sublime and the beautiful was much more substantial than Hume's. He defined what the beautiful and the sublime were objectively, that is to say, in themselves, in asking why it should be that beautiful things affect us as they do. He concluded that our Maker had so ordained our bodies that they should respond physically to the beautiful in one way and to ugly in another. Writing 30 years later, Immanuel Kant thought Burke's definitions of the beautiful and the sublime were excellent, but he couldn't bear this mechanistic, extrinsicist, empirical account of why they should be so that he found in Burke. And so in his third critique, he took everything Burke said and he drew it back into our subjectivity. That he said that beauty was our aesthetic judgment, our subjective aesthetic judgment, not about the thing itself, but about its presentation to us in ourselves. And so the beautiful is a judgment of taste. It's a judgment about our experience of something, rather than a judgment about the reality of the object perceived, even though it feels to us otherwise. And he goes further, he draws on Hume, his normal nemesis in a manner of speaking, to say taste is the ability to judge an object, or a way of presenting it, meaning subjective presentation, by means of a liking or disliking devoid of all interest. The object of such a liking is called beautiful. Hildebrand rejects this enclosure of beauty within the subject and its reduction to taste, even as he affirms beauty as a primordial phenomenon and as a value that demands our affective and therefore our subjective response to it. Values exist not in we who value, but in the object valued. And aesthetic values would exist even if there were no persons to view them, he tells us. And so he rejects the Kantian subjectivization of value, and also Hume's analogous claim that beauty is an effect of objective attributes on the subject and in the subject. And he goes on to take on every argument for beauty as a feeling or some other kind of subjective activity within us. He even goes so far as to distance himself from St. Thomas Aquinas, because Aquinas' first account of beauty, which is by no means his definitive one, but Aquinas' first mention of beauty is that beauty is that which pleases when seen. And even this strikes Hildebrand as too subjective. And so he distanced himself from Aquinas and then from Jacques Maritain, Aquinas' great elaborator on aesthetics, on philosophy of beauty. Why does he do this? I'm going to try to be as brief as I can, and I think I can be quite brief on this. As a matter of routine, we can tell the difference between something outside of us and the feeling we have in response to it. For instance, sometimes you might look at a person and because you are grouchy, because you have slept poorly, for any number of reasons, you might project onto that person ill intent or some kind of quality of being evil or being your enemy and turn on that person with rage. But 5 minutes later, after you get a cup of coffee or something, you stand back from yourself and you say, I was projecting onto that person. What does this tell us? Even in our everyday subjective experience, within that subjective experience, we routinely distinguish between that which is beyond us and out in the world, as it were, and that which is proper to us and only us. Well, when I look at a waterfall and I say that's beautiful, it's clear that even within my subjective experience, I'm talking about the waterfall. And I'm distinguishing the waterfall in its beauty from the feeling of beauty, the feeling for beauty that I have within myself. I just find this an absolutely brilliant, categorical, decisive critique. If within our own subjective analysis of ourselves, we cannot possibly affirm that beauty is subjective, then what other basis would we have for that? We have none. And so Hildebrand spends a long time going through different subjective theories, the first 80 pages of his Aesthetics, I think, to be precise. And at every turn, he shows how much question begging occurs there. In fact, we know from our subjective experience that beauty is not subjective. And if we have not, and if it's not subjective there, it's not going to be subjective anyplace else. Now, just one second point. Kant speaks of the disinterestedness of aesthetic experience. What he means by that is that the full definition of the beautiful is that we say that we find the beautiful, it's a liking without a concept and without interest, by which Kant really just means, by concept, he means you're not arriving at some specific truth knowledge, some new fact. So when you judge something beautiful, you're not saying, oh, that's a painting. When you call something a painting, then you're assigning a concept to this phenomenon. When you say it's beautiful, you're not assigning a concept to the painting. You're actually just responding to how the painting affects you, says Kant. So that's what it means for the beautiful to be without a concept. For it to be disinterested, what he means is you are merely judging the perception of the object coming to you and not judging its practical usefulness, its goodness for something you might do with it or some role it might play in your moral life. So von Hildebrand, at several points in both Volume 1 and Volume 2 of the Aesthetics, digs in deep to Kant's idea of the disinterested and affirms it. Now, Kant is giving us a pretty bourgeois, watered down, unsatisfactory version of an account of beauty that goes back at least to Plato's Phaedrus, where the proper response to the beauty is always to stand back in awe and in contemplation. All Kant's trying to do is to explain how that works if beauty's subjective. And I'll say more of that maybe in the question and answer session, but I'm just going to say what von Hildebrand does is he basically affirms this account, and he affirms it in several brilliant ways. The first one is this. In a manner of speaking, von Hildebrand's account of how we engage in the world, his account of what it means to be in the world, is itself in an aesthetics. There are proper and improper responses to the values we perceive in the world. And so if there's an improper response to a value, that means that a certain aestheticism, a certain setting aside of those tendencies to the improper may be necessary if we're to respond rightly to the values that we find in the world, including aesthetic values. And he goes on to say, amongst other things, that aestheticism, what John Henry was just condemning, it fails not because you can't contemplate the beautiful for the sake of beauty. You can indeed. It fails because it pretends to think that you can only contemplate the beautiful as beautiful if you exclude all the other possible values from it, which is clearly not the case. You read Virgil's Aeneid and you may find it beautiful, but you also learn a thing or two about the moral value of piety, for instance. Finally, when he turns to the work of art itself, the work of art makes ascetical demands upon us so that if we're to respond correctly to it, our response cannot be mired in certain things like its familiarity to us, our knowing the artist. All these things are fine, but they're not properly aesthetic responses. There is a right way to respond to the values of the work of art as a work of art. And in doing this, what von Hildebrand is affirming is that the work of art is what T.S. Eliot called autotelic. It has a hard, integrated reality proper to itself that is not reducible to the various sentimentalities or extrinsic sentiments that we may have in regard to it. And so he is simultaneously reaffirming something about the Victorian age. Yes, the affections, the affective response to the work of art is not only central, it is fundamental to our proper response to it. But the Victorians went too far because they thought all affective responses, especially those that were most personal or sentimental, that those were actually the best ones to affirm. Whereas von Hildebrand stands as a good modernist saying, no, no, no. There are better and worse. There are proper and illegitimate affective responses to the work of art and to anything of beauty. And so we have this wonderful irony that he's a great modernist who simply knew what the modernists were doing better than Pound or Hume or Eliot or many of his German contemporaries happen to know. So if for no other reason, this is the von Hildebrand's aesthetics is the first truly great modernist art manifesto because it's the only one that really knows what it's doing.
Thank you all. That was excellent. We have a lot of questions. I think we're going to run a few minutes over and just push back the next session so that we have some time to answer some of them. So first off, what would you all say is the role or the weight of the responsibility on the artist to form the affective life of the church and of the world? Would you say that this is a moral responsibility? What about the artist who creates art which bears negative values, such as modern art, which portrays violence or abuse?
It's a complicated question.
One quick thing to say, I just had said my piece, so I hate to jump in right away, but just very quickly, that last part of the question has always been one of the great problems of aesthetics. Going back to Aristotle's Poetics, he says, we enjoy looking at things, including dead bodies. And you think, well, no, I don't really enjoy looking at dead bodies. But then you think, wait a second, wasn't that a beautiful Grecian urn in the Metropolitan Museum of Art that had the death of Hector on it? You think, I guess I do like looking at dead bodies. My account of beauty is more deeply aligned in the Christian Platonist tradition than von Hildebrand's is, I think. And my proposal would be that that beauty is nothing other than that property of being that shows that existent form can disclose itself to us, that existent form, that being can share itself or give a lot of ground if we just disagree on how this works metaphysically. And so some things that might not be pretty can still be beautiful because they somehow convey the way in which being gives itself to us, both as an intelligible truth and also as a moral good, in the sense of it's good that it exists. And so, you know, the ugly scene on the Grecian urn does not merely remind us of a death, it also reminds us of the fullness of form of things that exist. And so it's not pretty, but it's still beautiful.
Do you want to say something, Mark? I have something to add on that, but go ahead. You're muted.
I just want to talk about the responsibility of the artist in the life of the church. I think that was the first part of the question, right, Catherine? I suppose I think of the artist here having this sort of background of aesthetic value. The artist is the one who produces things that have aesthetic value. And here I want to draw a little bit on Maritain and the tradition that he initiated. the artist's responsibility as the artist is to the work of art, to producing a beautiful whole that that contains aesthetic value, and allows us to see those dimensions of being that James Matthew was just talking about. And for this reason, I guess I would think if the artist is being a serious artist, the first question they ask should not be, what's my responsibility to the church? What's my responsibility to God? What's my responsibility to anything other than the work of art? That is, they're going to do their best work if they focus on producing something aesthetically valuable. And when you, as an artist, when you take your mind off of that and you instead think about, like, how can I convey church teaching, or how can I convey a good message, or and so forth, you fail to produce a work of art that actually contains aesthetic value. So I suppose my advice is, and maybe I'm just speaking here out of my own taste, but my advice is the artist should focus on being a good artist, and not on their responsibility to these other things. Of course, all those things, if you're a Catholic, if you're a Christian, those things will inform your vision, but your focus should be on your vision of the beautiful and putting that into the work of art.
So to build on that, a couple of observations. First of all, just to quote a frequently cited theme in Van Hildebrand, Van Hildebrand is very serious about distinguishing the work of art from the greatness of the work of art, particularly great works of art, from the character of the artist. He thinks that there's a mistake in assuming that the work of art is somehow nothing but an objectification of the artist's inner life, of their personal subjectivity. Now, there may be emotional expression and these other things which he acknowledges, but the idea that the work is nothing but that, he thinks, could never account for these great works because of the famous fact of the sort of the morally average and sometimes fairly poor character, morally and religiously speaking, of some of the great artists that we have. He says somewhere, if Mozart would have been as great a person as his music, he would have had to be a saint, and he certainly was not that. So there's this mysterious divide, shall we say, between the creative artist, composer, writer, painter, and their work. And Van Hildebrand here enlists a strand of the Platonic tradition. He thinks of the artist in one respect as a kind of seer, a recipient of inspiration, which often comes despite a lot of moral failings. Certainly, the artist is not granted all of this aesthetic inspiration based on the merits that they might have as a personality. So that's not to say that Van Hildebrand wouldn't have said that that the vocation of that a Catholic who's thinking about their vocation as an artist in the church should sort of say, well, as long as my aesthetic gifts are fully functioning, it doesn't matter how I live. He would never have said that, but he would want to caution against this idea that the artist necessarily through their personal character will create better work. In fact, he thinks that there are a lot of very sincere people in the arts, Catholics, Christians in the arts, who have no artistic gifts, and the result is from an artistic point of view quite bad. And I think that's Mark's point, that the first focus should be on creating something of real artistic value. Anyways, as far as the I think we're out of time, so I'll save my comments there. And this is, again, not to push back on the idea that the vocation of the artist is not of central consideration. It should be said that Van Hildebrand himself perhaps doesn't give that primary attention in the aesthetics, but at the same time that he cautions against a focus on aesthetics that sees it primarily as personal expression of the artist, and therefore he cautions against I think he would probably have advised a lot of Christians who produced art, if he could have steered their careers, he might have suggested they not become Christian artists, given the kind of work that they produced.
I saw Mark was recommending Creative Intuition in Art and Poetry by Jacques Maritain, which is an absolutely marvelous, rich book. I like it primarily for the incidental arguments Maritain makes on the way, and I dislike it for its primary thesis, which is that there is this different way of operating in the world for the poet that's creative intuition, and that a primary value of the work of art is as a reverse sign, as he calls it elsewhere, where it reveals the inner spirituality of the artist. I find all of that horribly uninteresting. And so did T.S. Eliot, actually. He said it'd be better not to have known this stuff. It might be true, but I just don't want to know it. But Maraton is at his best, I think, in art and scholasticism, where he emphasizes some of the things that Mark says most forthrightly. And I'm going to recommend one other text that's even shorter than art and scholasticism, which is Dorothy Sayers' wonderful essay, Why Work?, which quotes Maraton from art and scholasticism on this point, that the artist's job is to do a good job. The artist's job is to make the good thing. However, if your thing that you're making is not a clock or the Eiffel, or I was going to say the Eiffel Tower, but let's set about that better. If your job is not to make a clock or a microwave, but rather to make a work of fine art, you need to be aware that the telos of your operation is to make the beautiful thing worthy of contemplation, and in the contemplation of it, revelatory of being. And that is an immense responsibility. And there's a paradox to it, because the artist is often not a particularly good person, but the artist will have that particular elan for being, that particular eidetic intuition, to use Maraton's term for it, that allows him at least to see clearly about the nature of what things are in their being. And that is a moral achievement, though it's perhaps not the highest moral achievement.
Can I just add to that? I feel that my previous comment was unsatisfactory, and I think I know some of you who are probably dissatisfied with what may seem disparaging with respect to the vocation of the artist. So let me just again say that one only has to read the letter to artists of John Paul II to see this very high and noble calling that he sees for the Christian artist. But I want to note that Van Hildebrand himself takes up this issue of the, he doesn't take up the question of the character of the artist, but he takes up the issue of the aesthetic and the religious themes that you have in works of sacred music. And he puzzles over it. He asks, is the Matthew's Passion, or is the Missa of Bach, or the Missa Solemnis of Beethoven, is it a religious work? Is its primary theme divine worship, or is its primary theme an aesthetic theme? And he concludes, after some going back and forth with himself, that it really has a dual theme, that the Matthew's Passion is ultimately its purpose, and he thinks Bach's intention was to create an entry point into the world of the Gospels, particularly into the Passion of Christ. But it stands on its own 2 feet as one of the greatest musical masterpieces ever written. In some senses, Van Hildebrand acknowledges these pieces really find their highest artistic expression in the concert hall, because you need a level, you need an orchestra and a conductor that most churches will never have. You find those in the concert hall, and there's even something very fitting about these pieces being played there. So while this doesn't address the issue of the character of the artist per se, it's hard to imagine that Bach could have written the Matthew's Passion but for his very, very profound Christian faith. So Bach is a kind of maybe an exceptional character. I think of Bruckner. And there are many other instances of artists where it wasn't necessarily that they were a particularly outstanding morally. I don't know that about Bach or Bruckner. Bruckner was in a way a very simple kind of person. But there was nevertheless this very, very deep faith that seems to have informed their work in ways that produce this, as Van Hildebrand says, these ultimate masterpieces that are as much works of, he doesn't just say they're works of religious art. He says these are works whose purpose is to assist in divine worship. But at the same time, they're ultimate artistic masterpieces. So this only alludes, I think this probably complexifies these questions regarding the character of the artist, because after all, it would be very difficult to imagine an artist with absolutely no faith being able to provide the kind of scriptural commentary that Bach produces in his music. I mean, the music, as it moves through the scriptural texts, is essentially scriptural commentary in musical form. The way in which the words of Christ, for example, in the Matthew's Passion are always accompanied by the high strings, which create a kind of halo effect. And even the musical line is so revealing of a really a very particular interpretation of those scripture passages. So anyways, I've only made the matter more complicated, but maybe by making it more complicated, it's a little more satisfactory to those who are artists on this listening in or those who are concerned with these questions of music in the church. So I'm sorry for complexifying things, but I think it's probably more adequate to acknowledge that there are some difficult and unresolvable issues.
Thank you. We are very over time at this point, so I'm just going to thank you all one more time, and we're going to be back in just a few moments with our next session on affectivity and gender.